August 3rd, 1967. Mekong Delta, South Vietnam. The water was the color of coffee with too much cream, thick with sediment that had traveled 1,000 miles from mountains I'd never see. It moved slowly, deceptively calm, reflecting the morning sky and fragments between the water hyacinths that choked the surface. Beautiful, almost, until you remembered that beauty in Vietnam was always camouflage for something else. I was 24 years old, a captain, commanding Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, 9th Infantry Regiment. The Manchu Regiment, they called us, named for a campaign in China 60 years earlier that none of us really thought about. What we cared about was completing our mission and bringing everyone home from a place where the river systems were more complex than any map could show. We'd been in the Delta for 6 months, long enough to learn that the river wasn't just terrain, it was a living thing. The Viet Cong knew every channel, every hidden inlet, every submerged obstacle that could stop a patrol boat. They moved through it with the confidence of people who'd lived there for generations. The Delta was their home. We were still learning its rhythms. That morning we were conducting what command called a reconnaissance patrol. The intelligence suggested enemy supply routes running through a particular stretch of waterway about 12 clicks south of our base at Dong Tam. Our mission was to observe, report, and avoid engagement unless absolutely necessary. Simple on paper. Nothing in Vietnam was simple in practice. The company, 132 men divided among 5 patrol boats, moved upriver as the sun climbed into a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The boats were PBRs, Patrol Boat River, fiberglass hulls powered by water jet engines that could navigate in just 2 feet of water. Fast, maneuverable, and about as protective as a tin can. Each boat carried a .50 caliber machine gun forward, a combination of M60 machine guns and grenade launchers amidships, and enough ammunition to fight for maybe 15 minutes if things went completely wrong. First Sergeant Robert Chen stood beside me in the lead boat, his eyes scanning the riverbanks with the methodical attention of a man who'd survived 11 months in country. Chen was old Army, 31 years old, which made him ancient by infantry standards. He'd grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown, joined the Army to escape poverty, and carried himself with the quiet competence that made men follow him without question. "Water's getting shallow," he observed, watching the depth gauge. "Channel's narrowing. Don't like it, sir." I didn't like it either. The water had been perhaps 200 meters wide when we started. Now it was barely 80, with dense vegetation pressing in from both banks. The mangrove roots created a maze of shadows where anything could hide. The water hyacinths were thicker here, making it harder to see what might be hidden just below the surface. "How far to the objective?" I asked Specialist Morrison, our navigator. Morrison, no relation to the Morrison from Ia Drang, though I'd learned that was a common name in the infantry, checked his map against the GPS coordinates. "About 3 clicks, sir. Should reach the target area in 20 minutes. 20 minutes. In Vietnam, 20 minutes could be eternity or an eye blink. Time moved differently here, stretching during patrols when nothing happened, and compressing during contact when seconds determined who lived and who went home in a bag. The radio crackled. "Charlie 6, this is Manchu 3. We're picking up movement on the west bank about 200 meters ahead of your position. Can't get a clear visual through the vegetation." That was Lieutenant Jackson, commanding the trail boat. Young, 22, fresh from OCS, but he'd learned fast. In the Delta, you learned fast or you didn't learn at all. "Charlie 6, this is Manchu 3. Roger. All boats, weapons free. Keep your spacing." The order rippled back through the small convoy. I could hear the metallic sounds of weapons being charged, safeties clicking off. Every man was suddenly more alert, eyes scanning the riverbanks with renewed intensity. The jungle on either side was that particular shade of green that exists nowhere else on Earth, deep, wet, vibrant with life that mostly wanted to kill you in one way or another. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, leeches waded in the water, snakes hung from branches, and somewhere in that verdant hell, enemy soldiers might be watching, waiting, calculating. "Sir," Chen said quietly, "this feels wrong. Too quiet. Birds stopped singing about 5 minutes ago." He was right. The jungle had gone silent in that particular way that made your stomach tighten. No bird calls, no monkey chatter, just the throb of our engines and the slap of water against fiberglass hulls. Standard procedure would be to abort, pull back, call in observation aircraft or helicopter gunships to check the area. But we'd been operating in the Delta for long enough to know that caution and paranoia could be indistinguishable. We'd aborted missions before based on similar feelings, only to find nothing. Command was losing patience with patrols that turned back at the first sign of danger. I made the decision that would haunt me. All boats, continue mission. Stay alert. Gunners, watch those tree lines. We proceeded upriver, engines throttled back, moving at maybe 10 knots. The channel curved slightly, revealing a straight stretch of perhaps 500 meters. Perfect ambush terrain, a natural kill zone, where boats would be exposed with limited maneuverability. "Sir, I really think we should—" The first RPG streaked across the water, trailing white smoke, passing between our lead boat and the second boat behind us. It impacted in the water 30 meters beyond, the explosion sending up a geyser that drenched everyone in warm river water. Contact right! Contact right!" someone shouted. But by then everyone could see the muzzle flashes erupting from the eastern bank. The world compressed into a series of snapshots, each one burned into memory with perfect clarity. The .50 caliber on our boat opening fire, the gunner traversing right, brass casings ejecting in a golden stream, the M60s on the other boats joining in, their slower rate of fire adding bass notes to the .50's higher-pitched roar. The vegetation along the bank being shredded by our fire, branches and leaves exploding into green confetti. And then the return fire. AK-47s and what sounded like a heavy machine gun, probably a 12.7 millimeter Dishka, the weapon we called a Dishka. Rounds snapped overhead, cracked into the water around us, ricocheted off the boat's hull with sounds like hammers hitting steel.
"Evasive maneuvers," I shouted into the radio. "All boats, evasive." The PBR's water jet engines allowed for incredible maneuverability. Our coxswain, Petty Officer Rodriguez, threw the boat into a series of violent turns, zigzagging across the river, making us a harder target. The other boats followed suit, the neat convoy formation dissolving into controlled chaos. Another RPG, this one closer, exploding just 10 meters off our port side. The shockwave rocked the boat, and I felt the spray of river water mixed with the acrid smoke of explosives. Someone behind me was yelling into the radio, calling for support, his voice high and tight with the adrenaline that makes everything feel both faster and slower simultaneously. "Charlie 6, this is Manchu 3. We're taking heavy fire from both banks. This is a coordinated ambush. We need air support now." Both banks. That meant we weren't facing a small patrol or a squad trying their luck. This was planned, prepared, probably rehearsed. They'd waited for us to enter the kill zone, let us get committed, then open fire from positions they'd probably built days or weeks ago. "All boats, full throttle, punch through," I ordered. "Don't stop, don't slow down, run the gauntlet." Rodriguez pushed the throttle forward and the boat surged ahead, the water jet engine screaming. 40 knots, 45. The wind whipped at my face, carrying the smell of gunpowder and river water and fierce sweat. The .50 caliber kept firing, the gunner, Private First Class Davies, holding the trigger down in long bursts that made the barrel glow cherry red. He was 19 years old, from Montana. Had told me once that he'd grown up hunting elk in the mountains. Now he was hunting different prey, and the prey was shooting back. "Reloading," Davies shouted, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, even as bullets snapped past his head. The loader, Corporal Martinez, slammed a fresh can of ammunition into place, and the gun roared back to life. I risked a glance back at the other boats. They were following, zigzagging through water that had become a forest of splashes from incoming fire. The second boat was trailing smoke, whether from a hit or just from their engines running at full power, I couldn't tell. The third boat, Jackson's boat, was listing slightly to port. As I watched, I saw men moving frantically, and I understood with sick certainty that they'd taken a hit below the waterline. They were taking on water. "Manchu 3, this is Charlie 6. What's your status?" "Charlie 6, we're hit. Starboard side, about 2 feet above the waterline when we're at rest. Taking on water. We're—" The transmission cut off as another explosion erupted near their boat. "Can you maintain speed?" "Affirmative, but if we stop, we'll sink." The mathematics of the situation were brutal and simple. If Jackson slowed down, his boat would take on water faster than his pumps could handle. But maintaining speed meant his wounded, and I was certain he had wounded, given the fire we were taking, weren't getting treated. Every second we spent in this kill zone meant more casualties. Standard doctrine was clear. Maintain speed, break contact, establish a secure area downriver, then assess casualties and damage. But doctrine assumed you had air support available immediately. Our closest helicopter gunships were at Vinh Long, 15 minutes away. Artillery was useless, too close to the river, too much chance of hitting our own boats. We were alone. "All boats, maintain speed. We're going to run this channel for another click, then find an extraction point on the west bank." The west bank, away from the heaviest fire, which seemed to concentrate it on the east. It was a gamble. The enemy might be stronger on the west bank, might be waiting for us to do exactly what I was planning. But staying in the river meant death by 1,000 cuts, taking fire from both sides with nowhere to hide. The jungle flashed past on both sides, a green blur punctuated by muzzle flashes. Our return fire was continuous now, every weapon on every boat firing at anything that looked like it might conceal an enemy position. We were burning through ammunition at an unsustainable rate, but sustainability wasn't the concern. Survival was. 60 seconds in the kill zone. 90. 2 minutes. It felt like hours. The fourth boat, Lieutenant Davis commanding, radioed in. "Charlie 6, Manchu 4. We've got casualties. Request immediate medvac." "How many?" "3 wounded, 1 urgent." Urgent. The military's clinical way of saying someone was dying. Someone who needed a surgeon in the next 30 minutes or they wouldn't need one at all. "Roger, Manchu 4, medvac is inbound. ETA 15 mics. Hold together." 15 minutes. An eternity for someone bleeding out in the bottom of a patrol boat, their buddies trying to stop bleeding with pressure and bandages and prayers that were usually answered too late. The channel finally began to widen. The fire from the banks decreased, not stopped, but less concentrated. We'd run the main ambush, though that didn't mean we were safe. The enemy had shown they could coordinate complex operations. They might have a blocking force ahead, might be waiting for us to think we were clear before springing another trap. "Sir, west bank, 200 meters. I see a clearing." Chen pointed toward a break in the vegetation, a small beach of sorts, where the river had carved out a relatively open space. "All boats, follow me in. Combat landing formation." The 5 boats turned toward the west bank in a choreographed maneuver we'd practiced dozens of times. "Lead boat hits the beach first. Men deploy to establish a perimeter. Second boat lands. Men reinforce the perimeter. Continue until all boats are secure and you have a defensible position." In theory. Rodriguez drove the boat straight at the beach, cutting the throttle at the last second. The bow slid up on the muddy bank with a grinding sound. Before we'd fully stopped, men were jumping over the sides, splashing through knee-deep water, rifles up, scanning for threats. "Move, move, move!" Chen was shouting, organizing the chaos into something resembling a defensive perimeter. Men fanned out, finding cover behind fallen logs, in the sparse vegetation, anywhere that offered even minimal protection. The second boat landed, then the third, Jackson's boat, riding low in the water, men bailing frantically as they prepared to disembark. The fourth boat came in, and I could see men lying in the bottom, others crouched over them trying to provide medical care while incoming fire continued to snap overhead. The fifth boat was still 50 meters offshore when the RPG hit it. The explosion was enormous, a fireball that rose 20 feet above the river, followed by a shock wave that I felt in my chest. When the smoke cleared, the boat was gone. Just gone. Debris rained down into the water. Pieces of fiberglass. Equipment. Things I didn't want to identify. "Survivors in the water!" someone screamed. I could see them, heads bobbing in the river, arms flailing, some swimming toward shore, some floating motionless, face down, their uniforms and equipment pulling them under.
Third platoon, provide covering fire. Second platoon, recovery team in the water now. Men ran back into the river, swimming out to their comrades, pulling them toward shore. The .50 calibers and M60s on the beached boats continued firing at the enemy positions, trying to suppress return fire, trying to give the swimmers a chance.
We pulled 8 men from the water. 5 were alive. 3 weren't. The boat had carried 13 men total, which meant 5 were unaccounted for, either trapped in the wreckage, already drowned, or swept downriver by the current. Chen appeared at my side, his uniform soaked, his face grim. "Sir, we've secured the perimeter. Enemy fire is decreasing. I think they're pulling back." "Casualties?" 8 confirmed wounded, 3 urgent, 5 KIA. He paused. "Plus, however many we didn't get out of that boat." 13 men. 13 men who'd been alive 30 minutes ago, who'd been eating breakfast at 0600, who'd been writing letters home, who had plans for R&R in Bangkok or Australia or wherever they dreamed of going when this was all over. The radio was alive with traffic. Air support inbound, medevac helicopters 5 minutes out, higher headquarters wanting status reports, damage assessments, enemy strength estimates. The machinery of war grinding through its procedures, trying to make sense of chaos through forms and reports and radio codes. "Charlie 6, this is Falcon 2-1. We're 2 minutes out with gun support. Can you mark your position?" "Falcon 2-1, Charlie 6, we're on the west bank, approximately grid coordinates." I read off numbers from the map Chen held. "Recommend you work over the east bank. Confirm before firing. We may still have personnel in the water." "Charlie 6, roger. We're going hot in 60 seconds. The Huey Pun ships came in low and fast, their door gunners already firing before they'd even reached the target area. The sound of their miniguns was distinctive, not the individual crack of machine gun fire, but a continuous buzz, like a chainsaw made of death. 6,000 rounds per minute, tearing into the jungle where the ambush had been triggered. Rockets followed, 2.75-inch folding fin aerial rockets that screamed from the launching pods and impacted with explosions that shook the ground even from our position across the river. Trees shattered, earth erupted. Whatever enemy positions had survived our initial fire and escape were being systematically demolished. The medevac birds arrived next, marked with red crosses, unarmed except for the personal weapons of the crew, depending on the guns of escort Hueys to protect them while they worked. They landed in the small clearing, rotor wash flattening the vegetation, and the crew chiefs jumped out with stretchers. The triage was brutal and necessary. Urgent casualties loaded first, the ones who would die without immediate surgery. Then priority casualties, wounded but stable. Then routine, the walking wounded who could wait. The dead would wait longest of all, brought out after everyone living had been evacuated. I watched them load Private First Class Thompson, gut shot, unconscious, his face gray with blood loss. Specialist Rodriguez, both legs broken by the boat explosion, screaming despite the morphine. Corporal Chen, no relation to First Sergeant Chen, with shrapnel wounds across his back, conscious but in shock, asking repeatedly where his rifle was. The medevac lifted off, carrying 9 wounded men toward the hospital at Dong Tom. They'd be in surgery within 30 minutes. Some would survive, some wouldn't. The surgeons would do their best, but there's only so much medicine can do when the damage is catastrophic. More helicopters arrived, Chinooks this time, big twin-rotor cargo birds that could carry equipment and reinforcements. They brought a recovery team and engineers to salvage what could be saved from the damaged boats.
They brought fresh ammunition, water, medical supplies. They brought a sense of normalcy, of control, of the vast American military machine moving to support us. But they couldn't bring back the dead. That evening, as the sun set over the Mekong Delta, painting the sky in colors that were almost obscene in their beauty, we counted the final cost. 8 killed in action, 13 wounded, 3 of whom were critical and might not survive the night. 2 boats destroyed beyond repair, 2 more damaged but salvageable. 1 mission aborted without achieving its objective. On the other side of the equation, enemy casualties, unknown. Probably dozens, maybe more given the amount of ordnance we expended. But in the Delta, the enemy could absorb casualties we couldn't imagine. They didn't have to file reports or explain losses to Congress. They just recruited more fighters from the villages we were supposedly protecting. First Sergeant Chen found me sitting on my helmet, staring at the map as if it could explain what had happened. He sat down without speaking, and we shared the silence that had become its own language. "Thompson didn't make it," he said finally. "Died in surgery. Rodriguez lost both legs, but he'll live. Chen, Corporal Chen, is going to be okay. Burns and shrapnel, but nothing that won't heal." I nodded, adding Thompson to the mental list I kept. Names and faces of men who'd followed my orders into situations they didn't come back from. The list was getting longer. It would get longer still before my tour was over. "You did good today, sir," Chen continued. "Made the right calls, got most of the company out alive. That's all any commander can do." "I led them into an ambush." "No, sir, intelligence led them into an ambush. You led them out of it. There's a difference." I wanted to believe him. Wanted to accept that I'd done the best I could with the information I had, that the outcome could have been worse, that 8 dead and 13 wounded was somehow acceptable, because it could have been 80 dead and the whole company lost. But acceptance would come later, if it came at all. That evening, I just felt the weight of it, the decisions made in seconds that echoed forever, the mathematics of infantry combat where success was measured in how many you saved rather than how many you lost. "How do you deal with it?" I asked Chen. "The knowing that men died because of your orders." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the river flow past, carrying water from mountains to sea, indifferent to human struggles. "You deal with it by remembering they didn't die because of your orders. They died because this is war, and war kills people. Your job isn't to keep everyone alive, that's impossible. Your job is to complete the mission and bring home as many as you can. You did that today." "Doesn't feel like it." "It never does, sir. The day it starts feeling okay is the day you should worry." The night was full of sounds, crickets, frogs, the river gurgling past, helicopters in the distance, the occasional radio check from our perimeter guards. Normal sounds that should have been comforting, but weren't, because now I knew what those sounds could hide. Lieutenant Jackson came over, his uniform still wet from when his boat had taken on water, his face showing the strain of a day that had aged him years. "Sir, I wanted to thank you. If you hadn't ordered us to punch through, if we'd tried to fight it out in that channel, we'd all be dead." I looked at this young officer, just 2 years out of college, who'd commanded his boat through an ambush that should have killed everyone aboard. "You kept your men alive, Lieutenant. That's what matters." 8 didn't stay alive, sir. "No," I agreed. 8 didn't, but 84 did. And some of them only made it because you kept that boat moving even when it was sinking under you. Remember that when the rest gets heavy." He nodded, though I could see in his eyes that he was adding his own names to his own list, starting the collection of ghosts that every combat leader carries. That night I wrote letters to Thompson's parents in Ohio, telling them their son had been brave, had fought well, had saved lives by his actions. It was partly true. To the families of the others, telling them variations of the same necessary fictions, that their sons and brothers and husbands had died for something meaningful, had not suffered, had been heroes. I didn't mention that Thompson had spent his last minutes screaming for his mother. I didn't mention that Sergeant Harris had died instantly when the RPG hit, his body simply ceasing to exist in a way that made identification only possible through dental records. I didn't mention that Private Johnson had drowned trapped in the sinking boat, found later by recovery divers, his face frozen in the final terror of a death where you know it's coming but can't stop it.
Those truths were mine to carry, part of the weight that came with command. The weeks that followed established patterns that would define the rest of my tour. More patrols through the Delta's waterways, more ambushes, though none as devastating as that first one. More casualties, more litters home, more names added to the list I kept in a notebook that I'd eventually burn because I couldn't stand to look at it anymore. I learned the river's moods, its dangers, its deceptions. I learned to read water depth by color, to spot the subtle signs of a disturbed bank where someone had recently been. I learned the difference between normal jungle sounds and the silence that preceded violence. The company learned too. We developed new tactics, new procedures, never the same route twice, never predictable timing, always air support on standby, always an escape route planned before entering confined terrain. The lessons were written in blood, but we learned them. Chen would finish his tour and extend for another, making it 3 tours in Vietnam, more time in combat than anyone should have to endure. Last I heard, he'd retired as a sergeant major, spent 25 years in the Army teaching officers at Fort Benning the lessons he'd learned the hard way in the Delta. Some of them probably listened. Most wouldn't really understand until they faced their own river, their own moment of decision. Jackson would earn a Silver Star for his actions that day, though he'd later tell me he'd have traded the medal to have those 8 men back. He'd survive his tour and return to civilian life, becoming a teacher in Oregon where no rivers reminded him of the Mekong. Thompson, Harris, Johnson, and the others would be flown home in aluminum caskets, their families receiving folded flags and the thanks of a grateful nation that was increasingly uncertain about what it was grateful for. Their names would be added to the wall in Washington years later, carved in black granite alongside 58,000 other names, each one a story, a life, a family forever changed. The Mekong would continue to flow, carrying its burden of sediment from mountains to sea, indifferent to the brief human drama played out on its surface. The Delta would remain contested terrain, claimed by different forces at different times, its true masters the farmers who'd lived there for generations and would remain long after all the foreign soldiers went home. But that evening in August 1967, as the sun set and the jungle settled into its nighttime rhythms, I sat by the river and understood something fundamental about war. It's not glory, it's not adventure, it's not the grand strategies discussed in comfortable offices far from the sound of gunfire. War is the weight of decisions made in seconds that echo for lifetimes. It's the knowledge that you'll carry the faces of the dead for as long as you live. It's the understanding that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to lead anyway, knowing that some of the men following you won't come back. It's the river running past, indifferent to human struggles, reminding you that nature doesn't care about your mission, your tactics, your casualties. The river simply flows, as it has for millions of years, as it will for millions more after all memory of our brief conflict has faded. And it's the silence that follows combat. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of thoughts too heavy for words, the replaying of decisions, the wondering about alternatives, the impossible calculations of whether different choices would have changed outcomes. Chen was right, though. The day it starts feeling okay is the day you should worry. That evening, it didn't feel okay. It felt like loss, like failure, like the terrible cost of war, measured in lives that couldn't be replaced with new recruits or fresh equipment or revised tactics. Years later, I would visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. I would find Thompson's name on panel 24E, line 86, Harris on panel 24E, line 91, Johnson on panel 24E, line 88. 8 names, carved in stone, representing 8 lives stopped, 8 families broken, 8 sets of dreams and plans and futures that ended in a river halfway around the world. I would touch those names, feeling the etched letters under my fingers, and remember not just their deaths, but their lives. Thompson, who'd wanted to be a teacher like his father. Harris, who'd been saving his pay to buy his mother a house. Johnson, who'd written poetry in his spare time, delicate verses about Montana skies that seemed impossible coming from a kid who carried an M16 through Vietnamese jungles. But on that evening in 1967, I didn't know any of that was coming. I only knew that we'd survived the day, that most of my company was alive, and that tomorrow we'd wake up and prepare to do it all again. Because that's what infantry does. We endure. We adapt. We learn from our mistakes and try not to make the same ones twice. We follow orders that don't always make sense. We trust the men beside us because there's nothing else to trust. And we remember. We remember Thompson and Harris and Johnson and all the others. We remember the river that ran silent before it ran loud with violence. We remember the weight of decisions and the cost of war and the faces of the men who paid that cost. The jungle settled into darkness around us, full of sounds that no longer made me flinch. I'd learned its language. I'd survived its lessons. And I knew, with certainty that was almost peaceful, that I would never truly leave it behind. Vietnam would always be with me. In dreams where I was back in that patrol boat, watching the RPG streak toward us. In sudden fears triggered by the sound of helicopters. In the inability to fully explain to anyone who hadn't in there what those minutes meant, what they'd taught, what they'd cost. But I'd also carry something else. The memory of men who'd faced the impossible and mostly endured. The knowledge that leadership was measured not in victories, but in bringing people home. The understanding that war wasn't about the grand strategies discussed in war rooms, but about the small decisions made in moments of terror by young men far from home. The river whispered past in the darkness, and I listened, and I endured. And I prepared for tomorrow, when we'd go back out onto the water, into the heat and the humidity and the constant threat, because that was the job and someone had to do it. The river ran silent that night, but I knew it would run loud again soon enough. That was the nature of war in the Delta. Quiet moments between storms, breath held before the next contact, peace that was always temporary, always fragile, always about to shatter. And when it did, we'd be ready, or as ready as anyone could be, for chaos that no training fully prepared you for, violence that no doctrine fully covered, losses that no victory could justify. That was Vietnam. That was war. That was the reality behind the strategies and the politics and the evening news reports that turned our daily survival into abstract numbers and map coordinates.
But we weren't abstract. We were real. Thompson and Harris and Johnson were real. Their deaths were real. And the memory of them, the weight of leading them into that ambush, the knowledge that I'd live with those decisions forever, that was real too. The river ran silent. The night deepened. And somewhere in the darkness, the war continued, indifferent to individual stories, grinding through its terrible mathematics, adding and subtracting lives with the precision of an accountant and the mercy of a flood. I cleaned my rifle, checked my ammunition, and prepared for tomorrow, because tomorrow would come whether I was ready or not. The river would flow, men would fight, and I would lead them, carrying the weight of Thompson and Harris and Johnson and all the others. That was the job. That was the cost. That was what it meant to be an infantry commander in Vietnam, August 1967, in a war that would continue for 6 more years, claiming thousands more names that would eventually be carved in that black granite wall in Washington. But not yet. Not tonight. Tonight, I was alive. Most of my men were alive. And that would have to be enough. The river whispered, and I listened, and I endured.